Thanks so much for joining me again on the nature of mental health. We're starting a three-part series on recovery and nature. There's been a growing movement across the country utilizing nature as a tool for substance use disorder treatment. Today we're joined by Dr. Leigh Beck, and we're going to talk about nature-informed harm reduction. Dr. Beck is a talented micro and macro social worker with an expertise in drug use. She currently owns a counseling and consulting practice in Baltimore County, Maryland. Dr. Beck teaches public health professionals in the areas of substance use disorder treatment, harm reduction, the war on drugs, and racial equity. Her doctorate focused on the political determinants of the opioid crisis, and her newest training presents nature-informed harm reduction. In addition to her counseling and consulting practice, Dr. Beck is co-president of the International Solidarity Organization, U.S. El Salvador Sister Cities. She also leads Beckys Anonymous, a mutual aid organization for white women who want to end white supremacy. As part of her certification program at the Center for Nature-Informed Therapy, Dr. Beck developed the Nature-Informed Harm Reduction training to explore innovative ways of improving the lives of people experiencing drug-related harm. The training examines the historical relationship between drugs, nature, and human development, introduces nature-informed interventions for addressing drug-related harm, and analyzes the impact of the war on drugs on climate justice. In addition to sharing this work, at the Center for Nature-Informed Therapy in Boston College School of Social Work, Dr. Beck had the honor of presenting at the 2025 International Harm Reduction Conference in Bogota, Colombia. This is going to be an information-packed episode, so strap in and get ready as we speak with Dr. Leigh Beck. Welcome to The Nature of Mental Health, the podcast where we explore how time outdoors supports emotional well-being, resilience, and healing. I'm your host, Will Henry, clinical social worker, nature-informed therapist, and founder of Riverstone Mental Health Collective. Join me as we dive into practical tools, meaningful conversations, and inspiring stories that help us reconnect with the natural world and ourselves. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Beck. We spoke before, and you shared so much important and insightful information. I just wanted to say I'm really excited for this talk today. So thank you for being here.
I'm excited to be here too. This is a topic I love to talk about.
Well, that's awesome. Before we get started, I wanted to give you the mic for a second, just to let you talk about yourself a little bit and some of the work you do in your practice.
Sure. So I am a licensed clinical social worker. I also have my doctorate in social work from Tulane University. I'm originally from Massachusetts, but I now live in Maryland, in Baltimore County. So about 15-20 minutes outside of Baltimore City. And I have a counseling and consulting practice. So I do both counseling, but also do a lot of training and consulting around racial equity issues, substance use, treatment and services. Yeah.
No, wow. Yeah. You're busy.
Yes.
So today we're talking about nature-informed harm reduction. And I thought we could kind of start by giving an overview of what harm reduction is, right? And how did the movement start, maybe? What it is?
Yeah. So harm reduction is a grassroots movement. So while it is like a public health response, it did really come out of community organizing movements, and particularly credits, for example, the work of the Black Panther movement, Young Lords movement around filling the gaps, particularly for healthcare, but as well as other things in their communities. And really draws on the legacy of grassroots organizing around HIV and AIDS, as well as the women's health movement. And it's a movement that's led by people who use drugs, for people who use drugs, with one of the core principles being that it's those who are most impacted by the harm of drug use that should be leading policy decisions, as well as leading service delivery, and that it's those who are kind of most impacted that should be empowered the most to have control over those decisions.
It makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I know, Can you, before we, I guess, go any further, I had asked this earlier, but is there like a delineation between harm reduction and recovery? Can you talk about that, like how they relate to each other, just so we have like that within that umbrella there?
Yeah, so I actually use the word umbrella when I often describe it. And how I sort of think about it is that harm reduction is this larger umbrella that includes recovery. So a lot of people sometimes think that the harm reduction movement is sort of anti-recovery. And actually, harm reduction is about including those who are committed to recovery, who are interested in pursuing recovery, abstinence, 12-step, any of those things certainly should be available to people that works for. But harm reduction is really this broader umbrella that really understands that people who are not engaged in those sort of classic recovery ideas or programming, as well as people who are maybe not committed to abstinence, deserve all of the same levels of dignity, respect, access to health care that any one of us does. So I sort of think about harm reduction as sort of this larger umbrella that includes recovery, but also makes room for and thinks about all of the other people and types of services and resources that all people should have access to.
I thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm doing like a series right now, so like a few episodes on, nature. There's been a big movement, and I've seen over the last few years, anyway, or last maybe half a dozen years, in the country, of people using nature in recovery centers and places like that. And I kind of wanted to it's a newer podcast. I want to kind of take it in that route for now,
Yeah,
and I
no,
think
it's
it's important.
awesome.
Yeah, yeah. Can you describe like the historical relationship between drugs, humans, and nature? I can start
Yeah,
there.
so I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about my project that I did as part of my certification process at the Center for Nature Informed Therapy. So I
Hmm.
came into that more from kind of the substance use world. That was where I had years of clinical experience and had a deep passion. Come from a community, a family. Significantly impacted by harms related to substance use. So um, I then was interested in kind of this idea of nature informed therapy and had the opportunity to kind of bring those together and look at, from a harm reduction point of view and then a nature informed therapy point of view, where does kind of that concentric circle overlap? What can nature informed therapy learn from harm reduction? And also kind of what can harm reduction learn from nature informed therapy? And the first kind of moment of just excitement in exploring this and importance of exploring this was I was looking a lot at the history of human use of drugs and nature. In the program, we learn a lot about kind of the historical relationship between humans and nature, how we developed
Hmm.
so intimately connected to nature, and how there's this understanding that kind of a lot of our behavioral health, mental health um, issues and challenges that we're experiencing are very much connected to our disconnection to nature.
Absolutely.
And as I was kind of looking at that relationship between humans and nature, there is this very long historical component of drug use and how drug use has been a part of the human experience for thousands and thousands of years. We've used it in our spiritual life, our social life, our economic life, our political life. I mean, drugs are just, you just looking at the history of the United States, there's a significant role that drugs play in that development. But anyway, so I really was able to understand how, from a nature informed point of view, we really need to kind of state that drug use is natural to the human experience. The core sort of first component of harm reduction is this understanding that drugs are a part of the human experience, and we need to sort of accept that. That's why prohibition has not worked.
Right.
We tried that, and it actually makes things more dangerous. And so really that acceptance, which does not mean you then ignore or deny the harm. There's a lot of things that humans do naturally that come with risk, that come with potential harm.
Hmm.
Sex being one of them. And we use harm reduction when we talk about sex. So really kind of this other way, this nature informed way of kind of articulating that first principle. One of the most exciting parts that people really get interested in is how I looked at how other how other species also use drugs. So we know that there are many types of animals that seek out mind altering kind of substances. And so again, just kind of highlighting that this is a natural part. Doesn't have to be. This doesn't mean everyone has to go out there and use substances, but
Right,
that
right.
we just kind of really need to accept that this has been and will continue to be a component of the human development and experience. And how do we really kind of shift the focus to, okay, kind of accepting that? How do we do what we can to reduce the harms related to that?
Could you give like an example? I know we spoke about it earlier, a little bit about what were you saying about some of the examples of other species using?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have this great visual that kind of details all the different kinds, but one that kind of sticks out to me that I often share is actually, and this kind of the legend behind this, but there is evidence that suggests that flying reindeer, Santa flying with his reindeer, is actually a drug inspired image and idea. So reindeer actually seek out magic mushrooms, and humans kind of would follow reindeer to then kind of find where they could also partake. But there's drunk elephants. That kind of idea is actually, there is evidence that shows that elephants, bats seek out fruit,
Hmm.
in order to kind of experience the impacts of being intoxicated. There's I'm trying to, let's see, I
Bees
also have
too, right?
yep, bees,
Yeah.
bighorn sheep,
Wow.
who consume narcotic fungi. You have jaguars that sometimes seek out ayahuasca. So again, just kind of across the world, we have evidence of how other species also kind of pursue that experience.
That's really fascinating. And I
Mhm.
thought that was so interesting that, it's often thought of as this is a human problem, a problem, but it is to a lot of people, and it's not to a lot of people. And I love the way that you frame that umbrella of it is part of our life, and and and
Yes.
and it needs to be addressed in a healthy, organic, I mean, organic's not the word, but in a healthy like way where you see all of it, not just it's all or nothing, right? It's a more inclusive kind of
Yeah, and again, we've
viewpoint.
tried prohibition, and we know
Mhm.
actually it increases harm and risk.
Yes, yes.
So again, it's not, and that it is one of the principles of harm reduction, where people think that, oh, this is then kind of, we ignore the risk, or we romanticize drug use, and no, it's sort of saying that when we accept that, when we kind of start from that foundational understanding that drug use is part of kind of the human experience, then we can really focus on kind of the reality, and looking again for those ways that we can reduce harm. Again, also, there's lots of people who use, and animals who use substances and never experience harm, who
That's
just
right.
experience the positive parts. Many of these substances have healing components to them. So there's, again, harm reduction really looks at drug use across the spectrum, where
Right,
we
right.
understand it's not black and white. You use drugs, you will get harmed, or you don't
Exactly.
use drugs, you won't get harmed. There's also people who've never used drugs who get impacted by drug use related harm. Their loved ones, their communities are experiencing it. Um, so again, just kind of, once we can sort of just come from that foundational acceptance, it really helps us be much more effective in actually creating safe and healthy communities.
Absolutely. It's looking at all the pieces. You have to look at all the pieces to address the issue is I
Hmm.
think is
Hmm.
important.
Yeah.
So when we think clinically about, we move into like the micro piece, right?
Hmm.
So we're going to move in clinically. What can you kind of give an overview, I guess, I mean, there's a lot of different, I know, s- specific interventions that can be used, but like within the framework, how do you think about using interventions in a harm reduction framework?
Yeah, so we know, the research really does show us how sort of universally impactful a better connection and relationship with
Mm,
nature can be for everyone.
absolutely.
So there's a lot of research that just shows kind of again how effective it is in just reducing anxiety, depression, the easier access a lot of people have to mindfulness. Again, no matter who you are, whether you use substances or you don't, that's going to be kind of helpful. So for people who are using substances and maybe experiencing some type of drug related harm, we know that those same sort of interventions that help other people are going to benefit people experiencing drug related harm. Now, I know we know that for people who may be struggling with their drug use and experiencing more risk or harm, a lot of kind of the issues that go into exacerbating that harm are kind of those classic, underlying issues of anxiety, depression, stress.
Hmm.
Again, kind of those universal things, but things like grief, that's a major issue that
Yes.
comes up for a lot of people again that who personally are using drugs, or if you have a loved one or a family member, a community impacted by drug related harm,
Hmm.
grief is a major component of that experience and that struggle and that harm. And there's some really wonderful interventions that have been I've seen be really effective again when including sort of this nature component. So whether that's having like a grief spot. So a lot of people, the classic before was people who struggled with sort of sitting with their grief or fully feeling their grief. We'd often talk about like the shower or the car, but now seeing people kind of pick a nature spot and kind of that being that space. I've heard a lot of people talk about, and there's a lot in nature informed therapy that talks about, how nature is this non-judgmental, really sort of, again, a major harm reduction principle of accepting and meeting people where they are and unconditional, positive regard, no matter who
Hmm.
you are or what your choices are. And there's a lot of people talk about just kind of in nature experiencing that, even on a better level than with other humans.
Yeah.
Um, when I worked in detox a long time ago, we would do a spiritual assessment, and obviously, God and religion came up a lot for people who identified as having a spiritual self. The second answer was often nature.
Yep.
People talking about kind of
Makes
where
sense.
they felt spiritual, where they felt that connection. And so there's kind of, a lot of it is just the all of the nature informed interventions really are easily applicable. And I'm sure you'll hear this a lot with kind of the recovery programs are just really wonderfully complementing to other recovery interventions. I'm a big motivational interviewer fan, and one of the things I loved through this project was in nature informed therapy use nature a lot as metaphor. Using there's kind of the classic like riding the wave of cravings and recovery
Right.
talk. But I do stages of change, talking with people about stages of change a lot, and pre-contemplative, contemplative, like that language is not very accessible.
Right.
And there's this wonderful book about nature informed recovery that talks about the seasons being kind of the metaphors for nature, stages of change, and
I
how
love
much
that.
easier my conversations are now that we can kind of talk about spring, summer, winter, fall instead of pre-contemplative or contemplative. It just is much more accessible and connects with
Yeah.
people, and have done some amazing, like I'm thinking of one moment with someone where we were outside that kind of winter to spring time, and we had the geese, coming home, flying over, and we had this just beautiful conversation about that kind of stage of change and that in between part, and how do we see that in nature, and what does that mean in nature, and why are kind of there these seasons of change, and So there's just these wonderful ways that, again, nature informed therapy talks about using nature as metaphor, as
Hmm.
mentor. How do we look to the tree and fall and think about letting go? And these are all conversations I've had with people. And now to be able to kind of bring nature into it, there's just such a much more powerful connection and much easily more accessible way to kind of engage and help people open up and sort of be internally reflective when you bring nature into it.
Absolutely. You said so many important things, but you mentioned one thing there. You mentioned mentor, and that's something I actually wrote down from our earlier conversation. You mentioned, I wrote it down here, metaphor, mentor, and mirror.
Hmm.
And can you like it's I know you started explaining a mentor looking to a tree for like, for as a mentor, but what about mirror and, how does that, can you give some other examples of that? That was really
Sure.
fascinating.
Yeah, so mirror is kind of looking to nature to kind of mirror who we are, the human experience. So looking to nature and kind of how does adaptation, right? How do we see our ability to adapt, or what your experience of adapting was in nature? How there's this idea of life landscape, and I worked with sort of thinking about like if your life sort of was mirrored in nature, what would it be? Would it be the desert? Would it be a dense
Love that.
forest? Would it be the ocean? Why? I had someone who I was working with who was her child was struggling with substance use, and she was really struggling with kind of how to show up and be a mom. And she talked about before she felt like this river that was constantly feeding into the ocean and kind of was just feeding all this energy, and it kind of she never even really knew where it went, and it just felt vast, kind of like she could never give enough. And she transitioned to, I don't want to be that, I want to be a tree, I want to kind of put my roots down, and I'm here in one place and will always be the shade that my daughter can, because she's kind of constantly been out in the streets looking for her daughter. And she just sort of was coming to a point where also just kind of in her own health and things like that. And she was struggling with like, if I'm not doing that, then who am I going to be for my daughter? And so she really just kind of saw mirrored in nature that this idea of, I want to be that planted tree. I'm going to be at my home. She always knows she can come home. I'll always kind of give that shelter, but I'm also kind of working on getting my sort of nutrients and being able to kind of feed myself to be that strong place
Wow.
for her.
That's
Um,
so moving and powerful. Wow.
yeah,
That's such an
yeah,
amazing, and you're right. I mean, the way nature can, I don't want to say create those metaphors, but they're so available. There's
yeah,
so many different ways, the
so
seasons, like
many
you're
different,
saying, so many different ways.
yeah,
I use a stream a lot in my work.
yeah,
So, I
yeah,
do a lot of work with anxiety, depression, ADHD,
yeah,
things like that. And I have a sanctuary I go to when I do this, work. And there's a like a lake with a dock, and then there's a stream running out of it. And there's like this rock outcropping. There's a bench sitting overlooking. It's this perfect like loop I take, but
hmm,
I get to
hmm,
experience so many different things. And, but that was a really powerful example.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
there's cool, social workers, I'm sure, genograms, and people do a
Mhm.
nature genogram where instead of kind of drawing it, you're going out and kind of picking nature items that represent kind of um, your family. On a
Yeah.
macro, people who are in the public health world, there's a sort of classic idea of the upstream factors, right? And we use kind of metaphor, food desert, right? Like even macro issues, we use kind of these metaphors. And so again, kind of mirrors sort of looking, how am I represented in nature? Again, that grief walk will kind of walk through and say like, look to nature to kind of what does your grief look, feel like, sound like, is there somewhere in nature that it kind of helps represent what you're experiencing? Then metaphors, obviously kind of using nature as kind of metaphors, and then mentors sort of looking like, what can I learn from nature to kind of help me understand how to thrive, how to adapt? What do we see in nature that can kind of help inspire our own kind of ideas about healing.
Love that. Yes, thank you so much for summing that up so wonderfully. You mentioned macro. I thought,
Mhm.
before we get to that, actually, I wanted to emphasize, that I was just talking about like this sanctuary I go to in this wild space, and that's not always necessary. You can find, interventions and tools to use in city parks and stuff. And I know I wanted to emphasize that the importance of that.
Yeah, so I am a city girl. I was definitely in my program a little bit of an outlier in terms of um if we were to take kind of I even use this kind of the harm reduction spectrum. There's a spectrum of people's comfort in nature and experience in nature. And I was definitely more on the kind of less experienced in nature. I'm very comfortable in a lot of ways in nature, but a week, out in the wilderness, I might be a bit nervous about. But anyway, so yeah, so part of my project also was kind of really thinking about, and especially I've primarily worked not exclusively, but a lot with people kind of in inner city. And yeah, it was interesting sort of understanding the research that tells us, that even sort of connecting with natural elements, not even outside, a plant, certain smells, sounds, even visual. So I don't do as much of this work, but I was really curious, like around like video game addiction. Kind of there's sort of these ideas, like even just taking that break and looking at a picture of forest does things to help
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of research that kind of indicates that yes, that kind of even in these smaller doses, even in kind of these not as naturally rooted sort of sources, again, just that sensory experience can really make you. And I've noticed that in my own daily life. Like I now look at nature totally differently. It really changed my relationship with gratitude and made that much more easily accessible to me. So yeah, and just kind of helps us sort of assess our environment. If you don't have natural elements or you're not interacting with nature, and to your point, kind of what could that look like if it's just the city park, if it's just opening your window, if it's just getting that sun. So yeah, I've also, and I mentioned this to you, I haven't explored this, but I've also been really interested in, I've focused a lot on kind of how nature as a positive experience, but I've worked with a lot of people who are unhoused and kind of have had this relationship with nature that's kind of shaped by things out of that they don't have a lot of power over. So people who've chosen, I would go have to look for people in the forest behind the mall because they don't want to live in the shelter and kind of are choosing to live out
Right.
in the natural elements, and just kind of what their experience, their relationship, nature informed therapy is starting to kind of explore like people impacted by natural disasters. So we there's a little, what's really exciting kind of that this is now getting so much enthusiasm. We're going to be able to kind of explore all of the nuances and kind of dimensions of this relationship between human and nature, and really helpful and exciting ways.
Absolutely. And it's also important, and which leads us perfectly into like the policy and philosophical, macro,
Yeah.
aspects of that. So, talk, I know we mentioned a lot earlier about there's the war on drugs, there's race and class, there's climate
Hmm.
justice. It's just three,
Hmm.
of the of what I'm sure are more. But I don't know where you want to start with that. But I know you're
Yeah, I guess
passionate.
I can just kind of so as part of this training that I created, um and that I've had the honor of being able to present this at like the International Harm Reduction conference, which was just so amazing. But more importantly, this was kind of me bringing my knowledge and expertise, and there's um to kind of your point, there's a lot of kind of reflection now in kind of the recovery world around kind of nature informed therapy, but I didn't find as much kind of sort of
Mhm.
uh thinking in the harm reduction world necessary. Well, so I thought that, but then I went to the International Harm Reduction Conference and walked in where like the entry display is all about looking at the war on drugs through the eyes of nature. So what does it mean to be the river? What does it mean to be the
Yes.
jaguar? What does it mean to be the coca plant? And was just kind of blown away, where I was like, oh, I am definitely not the only person at all thinking about
It
this.
must have been validating too, though, right? To walk
It
in and be
was.
like, "Oh my god."
Totally. Yeah. No, it was validating in terms of, oh, this is kind of a helpful way to be, and validating in terms of there's so much more to learn, and I learned so much more and kind of just added to my experience. But one of the kind of most important parts of that discussion that I do include in my training, that a lot of people have responded to, is the connection between climate justice and the war on drugs, and really this call out. There's this great report um, that really kind of calls in the environmental justice movement in terms of saying, like, if you care about climate justice, you have to think about the war on drugs. You have to think about drug reform, because kind of those issues are the drivers of kind of the environmental injustice. And in terms of, and there's this great report that, if people, you can get it for, I'll actually, let me, you can download it for free on the internet. So it's called Revealing the Missing Link to Climate Justice Drug Policy. And it's by the Drug Policy Reform and Environmental Justice International Coalition. I know that's a lot,
Wow,
but
that's a lot, but
um,
I'll put that in
yes.
the show notes because that's important. That's great.
Perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and you can download it for free. It's lots of like visuals. It's very easy to read. So it's just a well-designed report, period. But then about this really important topic, where it outlines, there's kind of the key ways that prohibition and criminalization harms the environment. So the first is that prohibition really pushes drug production into key environmental frontiers. So the Amazon is like one of the best, not best in terms of most important, not a good example, but
Right.
an important example, where you sort of have the Amazon rainforest, which is extremely precious and important when we think about the health of our environment, being also
Globally,
one of
yeah.
the major sites of drug production and trafficking,
Mhm.
because it's criminalized, and and prohibition causes it to kind of push it into these frontiers. Then you have kind of drug profits being reinvested into environmentally destructive businesses. So whether that's mining is a big one, right? So when we think about kind of the laundering of drug profits, it's then often sort of reinvested into these environmentally destructive
Yeah.
businesses, cattle, things like that.
Mhm.
And then sort of we know the war on drugs, actually one of the biggest things that it has really contributed, not safety, not health, but corruption. So war on drugs is one of the kind of driving forces between the extreme corruption that we have in our political systems. And so that corruption then obviously corrupts the people's ability to determine any policies. When you have a
Correct.
corrupt system, you have a corrupt system. So the kind of argument that sort of that corruption led by the war on drugs then obviously impacts people's ability to push other agendas like environmental justice. We also know that there's a big link between murders of environmental justice warriors. A lot of times the people who commit those assassinations are connected, if not sort of very directly, sometimes a little bit less indirectly,
Mhm.
but oftentimes very directly, to organized crime. So you see again kind of that
Yeah.
very intimate relationship between the drug industry as well as these other sort of environmentally destructive industries.
Wow, yeah, there's so much there. So race and class is another big
Yeah.
issue within the harm reduction and drug war and all of that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a lot.
like,
I know that's
I
a
mean, that's a whole,
big.
I do another training just on the war on drugs. So I guess to say, I'll speak to maybe particularly United States context,
Okay.
but I think this is the
Yes.
case kind of worldwide, but the specifically the war on drugs has always been racialized and very arguably has really been more about an agenda of racial oppression than it has been really about reducing drug harm. We know it doesn't work. It's one of the
Hmm.
sort of biggest policy failures in our history. We wouldn't have the opioid crisis if the war on drugs had been alive and well for decades, and then we still experience kind of one of the worst drug crises in human history. Um, so, and so what has the war on drugs done? So kind of created this extremely corrupt system. It's now made us, the most incarcerated country in the world.
Hmm.
Again, primarily Black and brown people, despite the fact that we know that Black and brown people use drugs sometimes even less rates than white people.
Correct.
When we look at kind of, again, particularly a opioid crisis where you have the Sackler family, who represents arguably the most successful drug cartel, again, in human history. And you look at kind of the lack of accountability in that situation. You can clearly see kind of how race colors
Yeah. Yeah.
literally kind of how this works out. There's a great, again, I don't want to focus just on the opioid crisis. I'm kind of focusing a little bit on that because that's like most recent, but it's really important to kind of go back, understand kind of the crack epidemic.
I
The
was going
crack
to
epidemic
say, yeah,
is,
that's how the whole war on drugs kind of officially launched, right? Was in
yes, I
response
mean,
to that.
It it does
I forget.
extend. I mean, if you look at, for example, and please interrupt me because again, I have a whole other training on this and could talk forever. But if you look at, for example, the development of racial stereotyping in the US from the beginning, they have been inextricably linked to drug use. And this idea that kind of drug use plus a Black or brown person equals a very important threat to white people, particularly white women. So, as a white woman, I talk a lot about this, how white women have really been used to justify this. How, despite the fact that we're much more likely to actually be harmed by a white man that we know in
Correct.
our
Yeah.
family, our friend,
Hmm.
that sort of that racial stereotyping has always been really linked to kind of substance use, and has really been a major factor in driving our substance drug policy. And you can look across sort of different racial groups. So that's been used to oppress Black people, Latina people, Asian people, opium and Chinese people use kind of
Hmm.
see
That's right.
early on those kind of there's lots of kind of racialized images that you can look up that again just kind of document this history from the beginning. And this is one kind of articulation again of how intimate drug uses with our development. The Boston Tea Party was about rum. It was not about tea. They just didn't want to throw rum into the ocean
Right.
because it was more valuable. I don't have it right away. There's a statistic that shows, how much the average American at that time was consuming rum. And it was a daily, Paul Revere was going to the bars to round up men to fight the British. So we have, it's always been just an intimate
Absolutely.
player in all the parts of our, but anyways, so yes, the war on drugs has always been about a racist and classist agenda
Yes.
from the beginning. And if we look at that, has been very effective in perpetuating racial oppression,
Yes.
and has not at all been very effective and arguably more harmful. So it's not just that it hasn't been effective in kind of reducing drug related harm. It arguably also has actually increased risk, increased harm that people experience related to substance. Kind of the classic example is if I'm a drug user and then I become incarcerated, my risk actually goes way, way, way up across. I lose housing, I lose access to jobs, my health is going to be more endangered. I'm more likely to experience more trauma. I'm actually more likely, to then kind of escalate my use. So, we really know that the war on drugs does not achieve um, those sort of that agenda of reducing harm, but we also know that the war on drugs was never really about that.
Right. No, absolutely. Thank you for for all of that information. I wanted to kind of touch base. So, I mean, all of this information is so important. If some of our listeners are looking to use some like nature informed techniques to help themselves, right? In the idea of reducing harm and for their own drug use. Um, do you have any like advice or specific things you can say, recommend? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, so one is, this idea of mindfulness, period, right? Like there's kind of just mindfulness is great for everyone, just helps us kind of reduce our stress and, all the great things that mindfulness brings. There's also drug use. So sometimes I've worked with people on practicing their mindfulness and then encouraging them to kind of apply that same thing the next time they use their substance. So there's the kind of people have probably heard of like the raisin activity before, which some people know through nature informed therapy, some people know more through kind of like meditation and mindfulness. But like you take a raisin and you kind of slow down eating the raisin. You notice what it looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like on your tongue, things like that. And I've actually kind of done that with people and then encourage them kind of next time they use their substance, not sort of saying you have to, not again, these are people who are sort of mostly contemplating, reducing or changing things about their substance. And
Hmm.
I've seen us have a much easier time accessing, for example, like reasons why you use, what are the emotions around it, having an easier time, them noticing what leads up to them using and then after. And again, that's just helpful information for them to kind of empower. What does that help you sort of understand about your use? Does it open opportunities to change it or in ways that you think will be healthier for you? So kind of the mindful use part, I would say definitely kind of, for those who kind of know that their substance use is related to boredom, grief, anxiety, like anytime you're experiencing that, having kind of like your nature go to sort of activity like boredom, right? Like
Right.
people
Right.
talk about like I can never be bored in nature. But or like it's okay, or I can tolerate being bored and like yeah, I'm kind of bored, but I don't mind it as much,
Hmm.
when I'm in nature. The grief piece again, a lot of people have just articulated to me how nature holds their grief in such a more profound, people who've been in like grief therapy for years and they're like it's just a very different experience when I kind of connect with my grief in nature, and whether that's just like I said kind of having that grief spot or actually using nature to kind of explore how you feel about it or what grief is doing to you. um
In the larger
so
sense, right?
yeah.
Nature kind of, I look at it like, and I've said this before about when I'm out in nature, I go for a hike. I love to go for a hike. I try to do it every week, but I can't all the time. But at any rate, when I step out there, I feel like I'm being like held by something larger, right?
Hmm.
And you feel kind of like nature's arms around you, if you will, and it just feels safe in a way that I may be experiencing and looking into some of that grief and the grief spot, and it feels so it can be so powerful. I love that. Yeah. Knowledge is power, right? So all of these things, slowing. I love the mindful using piece because really slowing down and looking at what you're doing,
Hmm.
um, and not in a critical way, in a curious way, right? How does this reason? How is this? What is going on? And it gives you so much information, and the more information we have, right, the the more informed choices we can make, and obviously, which can lead to reduced harm, which is a whole point. Love
Yeah,
that.
the other thing, we do know, like, being in nature, like, what it does chemically to our
Mm-hmm.
brain,
Yep.
that's also, super important for people who are kind of trying to, rebalance their chemistry and all of that. What was the other?
The biophilia hypothesis, right, which kind of fits
Yes.
into all of that as well. With
Yeah.
the we're just innately drawn to the connection there, and that connection I often hear about people using, and the loneliness that they experience
Hmm.
sometimes,
Hmm.
and being out of nature kind of helps develops just this much connection, leads to, oh, I like that. So how can I be more connected? And it grows and it flowers,
Yeah.
if you will.
Yeah.
And it's yeah.
Yeah, and I remembered what I was gonna say earlier, but to that point, um, yeah, so it's interesting, one, just kind of so that for the listeners, I don't know if so, nature informed therapy helps us understand we were a biophilic people for so long, and only recently have we become kind of this videophilic,
Correct. Yeah.
sort of existence, and how that sort of this hypothesis that or thesis that that transition of videophilic, that disconnection from nature, has been if not kind of the greatest possibly contributor to kind of the behavioral health, mental health challenges that we see. And there's been a lot of kind of like focus more, they kind of, I love that comparison of, it's just sort of like being estranged or the attachment issues with your family, right? The impact
Mm,
of that is sort of the same. Nature is our family, and sort of us
love
being
that. Yes.
disconnected from that has similar things. And there's been a lot sort of looking at anxiety, isolation, loneliness, depression. But I'm also curious, substance use, right? Like, has that been a contributing factor to kind of the substance use increases we've seen? What does it mean, for example, like historically? And I've heard, it's interesting, I've heard stories now of like people using substances to connect to nature more. And there's kind of, an interesting thing to explore there, but also, right, like substances that are closer to the natural source, like, again, not to, you know often have more of the health, in some ways have health properties or less risk, right? Like, if we look at the opioid crisis and kind of this evolution from, this the kind of classic, so you can't get heroin anymore, and what does that mean? And a lot of people, when they're saying that, they're talking about just kind of how the risk has steadily sort of increased, kind of the farther and farther away sort of from that original sort of origin. What is it? The transition from having the war on drugs focusing on poppy fields to now it being, labs being made in labs, right? Like, that all has really
Right.
interesting kind of an important transitions. The other thing I just want to say is, again, we've kind of been talking about the positive, but also for our listeners, for some of you, nature may actually be a trigger. So we talked about
Mm,
this before. We've talked a lot about sort of the positive impact of nature, but I've worked with people where nature was a part of their trauma, whether
right.
that's they
It's
experienced a
important.
trauma in nature, things like that. But also I've worked with people where, I told you I've worked with a lot of people who hunt or fish, play golf, play soccer, things like that. And they talk about kind of, as soon as the weather gets ready, I feel that craving. Or,
Hmm.
I can't imagine fishing without, my six pack. That's kind of, it
Right.
goes hand in hand. So there's also that side that's important for us to also just be aware of, that, nature can also kind of be that, as kind of is classically called, trigger,
Sure.
and
Sure.
also can be kind of a negative or safe space if it's sort of associated with a traumatic experience.
I belong to a nonprofit, um, Reeling in Serenity, and we take people in recovery onto fly fishing retreats and help them learn to relearn really how to be in nature without having those triggers, without to relearn how to go fly fishing. Sometimes some are learning to fly fish, and some are relearning how to fly fish without substances, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm,
it's just to speak to that point. It's very
mhm, mhm.
very important. Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, this has been so great. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before we kind of wrap up?
I guess one last point I will make that kind of through this project that was interesting too is again, I kind of was talking a lot about kind of how people interested in sort of reducing harm can integrate nature. But there's also the other way where, I looked at sort of the principles of nature informed therapy, of outdoor therapy, and they include harm reduction. Like they let, sort of that
Mm,
philosophy, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar, like, going out into nature, leaving it better than, the same as you left
yes.
it. I forget what that
Carry in,
saying is,
carry out.
carry in, carry out, so kind of there always has kind of been in sort of this idea with nature, this idea of how do we not be harmful? How do we reduce kind of our harmful impact? And so I think there's also a way that kind of nature informed therapy world can kind of look to the harm reduction movement as well, and kind of their approach to things to kind of help really be grounded in that principle and that idea of no harm.
Love that. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Sure.
As we're wrapping up, do you want to? I want to give you an opportunity here to plug any work, website, socials, things like that you
Yeah.
want to tell us about.
Yeah, sure. So I have my website, dr.leigh.com. And mostly I post like any upcoming training, CEU events I'm doing, things like that.
Hmm.
Also has a little bit of my bio if people are interested. I've done speaking, I've done trainings. So if also just to kind of reach out, like I said, this was a first project for me, and there's so many potential ways to kind of to take it and go with it. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
would love to connect with people interested. I'm on uh Instagram. My handle is dr.leigh.beck. Um and yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so always looking to connect with people on LinkedIn. You can also email me at lee@dr-leigh.com. Um, yeah,
Wow, thank you so much. All of this will be in the show notes too. I just want to thank you again. This has been so just like enlightening and just wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
awesome. Well, thank you for the opportunity. And I'm really excited to hear your other guests. I think it'll be great to kind of hear just the many voices and the many ways that um, nature can address and be a part of us just creating safer, healthy communities. So yeah,
Yes.
I'm very excited.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Nature of Mental Health. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others find their way to this community. For more resources, visit riverstonementalhealth.com. Until next time, notice the small spaces where nature meets your day. Stay curious, and may you find resilience in every season.